This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Khannam.
And this is Jamal Dajani.
Jamal, we have a really exciting show today. To our Arab Talk listeners and viewers from all over the world, we continue to broadcast remotely from our locations in Northern California, continuing to bring you Arab Talk shows on a weekly basis. Today we're going to be covering a lot of things, Jamal. We have a big show. We're going to be covering European Union ruling on the BDS movement. We're going to be covering the ICC kind of collaboration between the United States and the Israelis in terms of their attempts to avert and avoid international accountability with the ICC. And of course, we're going to get an update on the coronavirus. And if there's time, we'll continue to kind of speak about, the ongoing struggles that this country continues to have with endemic structural racism. So it's an action-packed show today, Jamal. We got a lot to cover.
That's right, Jess. And we've had also, just to add, an interview with Dr. Hatem Bazian he's the co-founder of the Zaytuna College in the Bay Area right here, and also he teaches at UC Berkeley. And we talked about mentioning what this country is struggling with today, racism. Let's call it what it is.
What it is.
And the connection between racism and Islamophobia and this whole thing, So let's listen to Dr. Hatem Bazian. Joining us from his shelter-in-place in Northern California, Dr. Hatem Bazian, co-founder and professor of Islamic law and theology at Zaytuna College and at the departments of Near Eastern and Asian American and Asian Diaspora Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. Welcome again to the show, Dr. Hatem.
Thank you, Jamal, for having me. And we look forward to talking with you.
So as you have been watching, not only the United States, but the whole world have been basically watching what's going on in the United States in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd. Yet several Trump administration officials claimed Sunday that systematic racism is not an issue in the U.S. law enforcement agencies. And we've been hearing a lot of coverage from several networks and pundits on TV focusing on the rioting and the isolated cases of looting that we've seen, and not on the issues itself. So are people, as some claim, that they've been overreacting about racism in the United States? Is this like a temporary thing?
Well, I don't want to put that the Trump administration is even capable of analyzing and considering structural racism. If anything, they're a symptom of it as much as the broader racism, systemic and structural racism that we have. The police departments and how they conduct themselves in Black communities has a long record. Myself, and possibly I know that you were present during the Rodney King, where we got mostly involved in the Bay Area and San Francisco during the whole episode of Rodney King, which was one of the initial cases that recording and visual evidence of police that was just unleashing their force and power protected by their badge on Rodney King. And we also at the time witnessed, rather than focusing on the police, making Rodney King background history record as the problem. And that is, again, a result of this systematic and structural racism, where the victim is victimized again and again, victimized by first being beaten, victimized again by making them the issue that needs to be discussed, victimized at the court, with the legal system that is unjust in how it treats African Americans and treats them as guilty, and the record of police officers that end up killing and beating African Americans, and they never are taken into account. Derek Chauvin, who killed George Floyd, had 18 complaints, serious complaints against him.
You're right.
And if anything, you're talking about 3 strikes, you're out, which has been used to derail the life and the well-being of so many African Americans into the unjust legal system. Chauvin should not have been on the street. He should have been locked up much earlier, if not let go. And then the other police officers, I'm forgetting his name, he also have a record himself.
That's right.
7 different cases against him. And the question that puts itself is, what are the standards that these police officers have? And it's basically an old boys network that circulate through a process that the structure itself gives power and force to the police forces to continue to violate the civil and human rights of Black communities, and in essence act as if you are dealing with an occupation zone. They don't go to serve and protect. They go to shoot and, in essence, control. And it's also a mindset that has a long history. So again, taking Trump seriously on his analysis of race and race issues in this country and systematic racism in the police department puts an insult to the whole category of scholarship in there.
You've mentioned an occupation zone and the terrible images that we've been seeing on TV from the horrific death of George Floyd, with the police officer having his knee on his neck, to tear gas canisters being lobbed at demonstrators, to rubber bullets, and the roughing up of course, demonstrators remind me of the practices of the Israeli occupation army targeting Palestinians. We also know that law enforcement officials travel to Israel for training. Why do you think that the media has been ignoring to make this connection?
Policing and security engagement in Black communities has been a systemic and historical problem for the longest period of time. The police departments in their origination, especially in the South, came out of slave patrols. Those individuals that went out to seek and capture runaway slaves, disciplining slaves, and so on. So that institution have led and transformed into police departments after the end of the slavery and during the Reconstruction period. I'm saying this while knowing that many of the police departments right now go down to train in Israel. We have the report about the deadly exchange that some of the pro-Israel organizations in the US, whether the ADL, AJC, JCRC, and AIPAC and others, promote that Israel is the go-to expert for training. And it was not surprising that both AJC and the ADL and the American Zionist Organization, rather than actually addressing systematic racism, they actually are attacking Black Lives Matter. So that shows you some of these issues and alliances. Now, the police department have always been, in terms of its approach to Black communities, is seeing the Black communities as a zone to control, rather than, again, to engage in serving, engaging in approaches that actually promote the health and well-being of the community. And you cannot disconnect the policing from the broader economic, social, political approaches to the Black communities, redlining, gentrification that takes the investments away and shape and bring in developers. In essence, fits as one of the pieces in the broader structural erasure and targeting of the Black communities, and therefore their neighborhoods are structurally made to be in the conditions that they are in. And you add schooling and education, then you have a complete system of dehumanization and complete system of erasure. And as such, when you see these protests come up, for those who are outside that have been living what you call in Club Med type of worldview, they are taken and shocked because of what is happening. And again, the shock should be that they are completely unaware and completely delusional. And they assume that because they maybe like basketball and they understand or appreciate LeBron James or Michael Jordan, or because they appreciate some of the African-American cultural production music, they also assume that they're not, quote, racist because, how can I be? Because I like rap, I like their music, I like the sports. And this is, again, it's another aspect of commodification of the racism in ways that you're not even aware. And we could see it in some of the responses that our people are having. You really have to both deprogram yourself to begin with in order to understand what is taking place and what is occurring. So anyone that understands race and racism have to come to the conclusion that these protests are symptoms of a much more deeper problem. And what we need is to understand how to address it. And then the international dimension is also connected to it in the sense of all these training programs that were superimposed post 9/11 as well, in the sense of the militarization domestically, surveillance domestically that is connected to militarization and surveillance at a global level. So the local global in here is actually very present in front of us.
So I believe in spring 2009, you founded at Berkeley the Islamophobia Research and Documentation Project at the Center for Race and Gender, a research unit dedicated to the systematic study of othering Islam and Muslims. Obviously, Islam is not a race, but what's the connection between Islamophobia and racism?
Well, again, when we think of Islamophobia, Islamophobia is a form of racialization of a targeted group, meaning that we need to distinguish between how we define race. And there's many different race. One aspect of race and racism has to do with the skin tone or skin color, but other has to do with racial markers, because there are some individuals that are racialized because of their religion. So what is the meaning of anti-Semitism if we don't understand that the racial marker in there is religion? The Jewish community been racialized in Europe as a result of Judaism. There are some that racialize as a result of language. So language is the racial marker that is used. All these race and racism are social constructs that are supported by political structures that begins to intertwine it into legal inclusion and exclusion. So in this sense, when we think of Islamophobia is racializing Muslims as a result of a perceived identity, religious identity, that also has a racial skin tone. Most of Muslims are from the southern hemisphere and also been subject to colonization. So in this sense, when we study Islamophobia, we actually don't begin with 2001, 9/11. We actually go back to the arrival of Columbus or pre-Columbus. We begin with the Inquisition, where the construction of whiteness as an ideological framework, Europe was constructed to be a Christian and white, opposite non-white and non-Christian. And those two categories, Muslims and Jews in Europe, were both non-Christian, and all as well as in particular for the Muslim population and those Jews from North Africa were predominantly actually of African background with darker complexion. So you have to actually trace that trajectory of the emergence of this social construction of race emerges at that point and then gets to be exported into the new world that begins to formulate the same type of topography, which is interesting, the same type of Inquisition codes or black codes that were used in Spain through the expulsion of Muslims and Jews were applied toward native population. And then on back of that, you bring in the slave period or the enslavement of people from West and Sub-Saharan Africa. So you have to study that as a way to ground the understanding of what Islamophobia and how to approach it. I'm very critical of people who engage in Islamophobia from the field of acculturation and integration, and therefore it's basically, well, it's your problem. Basically, you are not integrated, assimilated, and not actually located in the normative practices that existed both in Europe and the United States. And as such, we have to locate it in that long history of race and racism and racialization in American history.
Yeah. So now we're at I don't want to call it a watershed event, but it seems that some people now maybe are hopeful, and they believe that the death of George Floyd will not go in vain. Are you hopeful that there will be a meaningful reform at the establishment level to put an end to profiling, racism, and police brutality? Or 6 weeks from now or 3 months from now, everyone is going to forget about it and we're going to go back to business as usual?
Well, it all depends on the actions and the work that we do. Again, politics is a contact sport, meaning that you have to continue to be persistent. We have a movement, or not a movement, but we have a moment of massive protests, both domestically and internationally, that have put a spotlight on systemic racism in the police institutions and policing. But the policing is given authority by means of the political leadership. So what we need is to begin to look at what are the ways that we need to actually put forth meaningful and long-lasting changes. So the abolishment and defunding of the police departments are on the table. It's very important because it shifts the boundaries of the conversation. We have to put immediate pressure on the local political leadership, city councils, mayor's office, because they are the ones that are responsible for the police departments. And what we need is to insist on civilian authority and oversight. We should not allow, whether we get into the point that the police department is defunded or abolished, in either case, that the authority to oversee and manage these police departments should be in civilian hands, and those civilian hands should be having the total authority to discipline, to formulate the trainings that are taking place. Fourth, I think we need to completely challenge the notion of surveillance that is taking place, facial recognition, all these tools that creates that the problem is the citizen rather than the institutions that are there. Other elements that has to be there is that we need to insist that the police officer should have, from the moment that a 911 call is entered, that their camera should be on and should be transmitting directly to both a civilian board and also to the police headquarters, and then also inside the car, because those who witnessed George Floyd was beaten up in the car as well. So the cameras in the car should be broadcasting as well 2 or 3 scenes, and it should go to both to a private, not a private, but a civilian oversight, and also the HR people within the institution. So we need to actually think of very serious way of how we think about policing and what's policing all about, while simultaneously pushing for defunding and abolishing, and then challenge, as you know, in many of these cities, these police commissions are basically a rubber stamp to the police department. We need to do away with that the police department actually selects who are the people that are going to be actually overseeing them. So we need to get rid of this. I'm more for of actually these individuals that constitute these police commissions as one, either to be elected or to be actually drawn from communities that are greatly impacted by police violence and be subject to a very rigorous oversight. And then the whole immunity that is given, qualified immunity that is given to the police, have to be ditched as well. So all those ideas, as well others, I'm speaking here just in terms of ideas, but I know that individuals that work on police reforms are having a whole host of ideas to try to change the systematic racism and systematic discrimination that exists, which is connected to broader. So simultaneously, we have to work on other areas of the society to get us to the point where we are at.
These are all great points. You've been listening to the voice of Dr. Hatem Bazian. I want to thank you again for coming on Arab Talk, and hopefully we can speak in person soon, inshallah.
That's the voice of Professor Hatem Bazian, professor and co-founder at Zaytuna College in Berkeley, California, as well as professor of ethnic studies at UC Berkeley. Well, Jamal, I think Hatem really was able to break it down in a very digestible, important, yet poignant way on the linkage between Islamophobia and racism in this country. Very compelling discussion.
That's right, Jess. And of course, the demonstrations are still ongoing. They don't have the intensity as they had before. Nevertheless, I mean, we've seen, last week we talked about, of course, the murder of George Floyd and, of course, the very moving funeral that he had, and also the demonstrations. And in the meantime, we've witnessed several incidents of police brutality, really, against the demonstrators. One of them was this 75-year-old who was pushed to the ground, started to bleed through his ear. And then Trump says that this guy's an agitator. You know, I mean, here he is.
Not just an agitator, but
Antifa.
Antifa kind of provocateur.
I mean, here he was lying in bed in the ICU unit, and the President of the United States is vilifying him. Instead of saying this should have not happened, he was peaceful, he just get pushed, and an entire basically group of policemen walk past him. They don't stop to give him aid. A couple of days ago, I watched also on TV this young Palestinian American woman in New York who was basically just tossed to the ground, like with this policeman who looked like a football player, you know, and again, she was just using her phone to film, and just he took her, boom, threw her to the curb. She was lucky that she did not go into a coma. She had a concussion, and she appeared on TV with her lawyer talking about her experience. She's young. She felt like she had to go and demonstrate, seeing what happened to her friends in the African American community in the story of George Floyd. And it really bothered me because, you know, here she was young, enthusiastic, peaceful, and she's saying that she was now afraid of the police. She stopped driving her car, and she was taking Uber all over the place because she was worried about getting stopped by NYPD because they all saw her on TV or they've known about her. And she was apologetic that if she would go again, even though she wanted to demonstrate, basically she was demonstrating for justice in this country. So things are still ongoing, and
but in some ways, Jamal, they're ongoing. But in some ways, even though the fundamental structural racist elements in this society are being kind of exposed yet again, and we're talking about hundreds of years of structural oppressive racism that Black Americans have been experiencing. It's also, we're able to see, based on what Hatem was saying and what we've been talking about, the extension of that racism to other communities of color, whether it be people from the Arab world, Middle East and North Africa, Latino brothers and sisters, Asian brothers and sisters. I mean, we're really seeing laid bare the full extent of the racist structures that are affecting all these different communities right now. And, if you're a young Palestinian woman, you still have First Amendment rights, but you could see that the police targeted this young woman among all of the protesters that were there, Jamal, and all of the people who had iPhones and telephones who were filming these things. They went after this young woman, and they're instilling this kind of fear in people, and they're, confronting their First Amendment rights. It's really very disturbing.
Yeah, the last question I posed to Dr. Bazian was, with everything that is going now, is this a watershed event? Are we going to see, because people say, justifiably so, that George Floyd changed the world, not only the United States, the impact of what happened to him. And I'm saying, well, how is that going to be interpreted 3 months from now, 6 months from now?
Right.
And basically, are we going to see, we see the outpouring sympathy and, of course, the resistance by the President of the United States and other groups, and trying to make excuses and shift the debate to, few rioters here and there. And whether we're going to see a structural change in this whole law enforcement attitude, profiling of brown and Black people, and racism in this country. This is the most important thing. And then, of course, last week, we dedicated a whole show about training these police officers in Israel and the brutality that is being practiced by the Israeli occupation army, and it's kind of being imported back to this country. Right. Is this part of that whole structural thing? Because we hear talk about let's stop the chokehold, let's stop the knee on the neck. I don't hear them talking about let's stop that training in this apartheid state.
That's right, Jamal.
Which has no value to human life or human rights. And that still, up till today, I don't hear this on CNN, Fox News, and others. They're trying to kind of ignore it. Total deafening silence.
I think that's right, Jamal, and I think that's a very important point. You see some of the branding and some of the talking points. Instead of talking about the larger issue of police and state-sponsored oppression and violence against people of color, you're seeing, okay, let's not do the chokehold, let's not do the tear gas, focusing on specific techniques instead of the larger issue, which is the use of state power and state violence against people of color. And this is why, and we'll be talking about how this relates to the Israelis a little bit later, but this has got to be making Israelis in power, and Benjamin Netanyahu and his ilk, it's got to be making them very, very uncomfortable right now, because their pass, if you will, on the international stage only comes because of the United States. And now that these issues are being confronted here in the United States, at some point, and we're seeing little elements of this coming from the Biden campaign. Not a lot, but some of this is going to affect the nature of the really problematic, regressive relationship and cover that the United States provides for the state of Israel and their violent practices. Because the number one militarized police state probably in the world right now is Israel.
That's right.
It's a militarized police state. They use tear gas. In fact, you know this. We did a tear gas study for the Berkeley Human Rights Center, and we found that the effects of tear gas on communities in Palestine, especially in the refugee camps, had a devastating impact on people's physical, emotional, medical health. And, It's the same
Well,
tear. It's the same tear gas.
Yeah, we've been seeing tear gas canisters being lobbed. We're seeing rubber bullets in this country.
That's right.
We're seeing the same tactics, the same, some of these images with the cloud coming from the tear gas just reminded me of scenes from the West Bank or Gaza.
Absolutely.
And the same way the militarized fatigue that these policemen were wearing also reminded me of the Israeli occupation army. You're listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco 89.5 FM. We also welcome our viewers on Facebook and our viewers on YouTube. I want to shift gears right here just and talk about the European Court of Human Rights, which ruled basically Thursday today that France violated the freedom of expression of pro-Palestinian activists who were convicted for campaigning against Israeli goods. The court just ordered the French government to pay 101,000 euros, about $115,000 in overall damages to a group of 11 activists, the global boycott, divestment, and sanctions, the BDS movement. Basically, they're activists from that. And of course, this was hailed by many human rights organizations. And this is started by, the protesters led by French activist Jean-Michel Baldassi.
Right.
These guys were just they were convicted. They were arrested. They were convicted. And this is the charge I never heard of this charge, of incitement to economic discrimination. Incitement to economic discrimination. In other words, if I walk into Safeway in this country or Whole Foods and I see a product that I don't like to buy, it doesn't have to be Israeli, and I boycott it, then I might be charged for incitement to economic discrimination.
Exactly.
And this is after it actually happened. They took part of this in 2009, a demonstration at a supermarket in the eastern French town of Ilzach, I think, and they were handing out basically leaflets calling for a boycott of Israeli products. And of course, France's top court upheld the conviction. So listen, just if you go in front of your favorite store here and hold leaflets and decide to boycott, maybe French wine or French cheese or whatever, is that incitement to economic discrimination?
Well, apparently the European Commission on Human Rights took a decision that really decided that, at least on the European stage, Jamal. Now, one of the things that I really liked about this ruling from the ECHR is that the ruling was unanimous. And so the fact that the entirety of the court ruled unanimously against this ruling in France says a lot about how perverse and how outrageous this French lawsuit was. As if you don't have the right, as you said, and as if we've been saying on Arab Talk for many years, probably decades now, talking about people's right to be able to pick and choose what goods they buy. And if you choose to boycott Israeli goods, which is a perfectly legal everywhere else in the world, we've done it in South Africa, we've done it in other places. This is back to this thing. We have to say it to the Israelis. You guys are not special. You do not stand outside of international law. And so what the ECHR has said to the Israelis loud and clear, you're not special. You are going to be held to the same standards.
Yeah, well, to the credit to the Human Rights Court, it described the protesters' actions, and I'm quoting from the ruling, as a form of political expression and a subject of public interest. It noted that Article 10 of the Human Rights Charter, which guarantees freedom of expression, allows for such protest action as long as it doesn't cross the line and turn it into a call for violence, hatred, or intolerance.
Exactly.
So it is my right to boycott French cheese. I won't because I like it. But anyway, I'm just giving examples to just maybe these kind of can relate to the French. If how would they feel if we decide to boycott French cheese?
But I believe, Jamal, this was not really a French thing. This was part of an elite Israeli kind of group that has infiltrated aspects of the French, government and French elite, and they tried to get away with it, and finally, with some justice, the European High Commission on Human Rights was able to rule unanimously. I want to quote from Rita Ahmed, Jamal. She's from the Palestinian-led BDS movement. She said, "This momentous court ruling is a decisive victory for freedom of expression, for human rights defenders, and for the BDS movement, and for Palestinian freedom, for justice and equality." And it confirms, by the way, Jamal, according to Rita, the 2016 European Union position defending the right to call for BDS against Israel to achieve Palestinian rights under international law. So this confirms the larger EU position on the role of BDS. So we have it both from a political and a legal standpoint.
Yeah, Jess, you're absolutely right. In fact, the European Union's Foreign Affairs chief at the time in 2016, Federica Mogherini, said that BDS activities were protected by the freedom of expression, even though the EU opposes BDS's attempts to isolate Israel.
It's a tremendous victory for freedom, for justice, for international law. It's a tremendous victory for the BDS movement, which has been gaining in its strength and its power all over the world. And I really see this as part of this larger thing that's happening, Jamal, that we're going to kind of talk, because we're going to talk about the ICC here in a minute, that basically what the Trump administration has been doing to erode international law and to erode international sanctions and to support all these thuggish dictatorships and apartheid states like Israel is coming back to haunt them. Because now the EU, as I said, both politically as well as legally, has come down squarely on the side of BDS. This also, I think, as I said before, this has got to be making the Israeli elite very, very nervous, because the BDS movement is going to get more steam internationally from this. And the Black Lives Matter movement, Jamal, as we heard Hatem speak about, dovetails very nicely with the BDS movement and the kind of goal of BDS, which is, justice and equality and rights for everybody, including Palestinians. So this is making people very nervous. Having said that, we should talk about how the United States and Israel are coordinating to attack the ICC, or the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court, universally, except for Israel and the United States, under the Trump administration, is really considered one of the most important international legal bodies, in the world, if not the most important legal body. And we're finding out, this is from in-depth reporting from Axios, Jamal, that the Trump administration and Israel coordinated U.S. authorization of sanctioning the International Criminal Court.
Okay, so let's just kind of think about this for a minute. About 2 decades ago, I mean, we're talking about, this is since the International Criminal Court was set up just to try the worst violations of international human rights law.
Right.
I mean, a lot of these courts, whether it's the United Nations, whatever, these came in the aftermath of World War II, right, to try criminals, and we saw what happened in Serbia and so forth, right?
Right.
And so now, I mean, this was actually created in 2002, the court, and it was created as a deterrent against the erosion of an international order designed to prevent a repetition of atrocities of the Second World War.
Exactly.
I mean, these are including, by the way, we talk about the Hague, the ICC, all these different mechanisms to kind of bring people who repeatedly violate human rights,
right,
and commit. And now the United States is against it. It's only two countries, by the way, who are against it: Israel and the United States, because they want to prevent any of their military or citizens from being brought to justice, right?
Right, and I can think of a number of examples. The atrocities committed by the U.S. military in Iraq, the atrocities committed by U.S. security and intelligence services by setting up torture centers and black sites all over the world to torture people illegally under international law. And of course, Israel is probably one of, if not the biggest violator of international rights when they blockade Gaza for over 10 years, or where they illegally annex stolen Palestinian land. So of course, the two biggest thuggish perpetrators against flaunting their nose in international law, Jamal, have come together. The Trump administration and the Israelis are now coming together to attack the ICC.
Yeah, and so now they're finding out, of course, because the ICC's chief prosecutor, his name is Fatou Bensouda, right? And it's a she has been threatening to investigate two states. They haven't started the work yet. The United States and Israel, right? This is now on the agenda. So the court, under her leadership, is considering examining widespread human rights abuses perpetrated by U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan. You mentioned Iraq, but I only saw a mention of Afghanistan, and crimes committed by Israeli soldiers in the occupied Palestinian territories, especially in Gaza, as well as the officials responsible for Israel's illegal settlement program. That's on their agenda. It hasn't yet moved, but there has been a serious plan to start the ball rolling on these, and now both Israel and the United States, both Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump, are attacking it from different angles.
Well, Jamal, I guess we should not be surprised that two of the biggest thugs who flip and shun international law, who flaunt their power, are very nervous about this. And, we have talked about this, how these are two individuals who should be very nervous about these mass global movements against racism, against apartheid, and against human rights. These are the two people in particular, and two governments in particular, that need to be very nervous about it. I mean, when you think about what the Trump administration has done, tried to defund the WHO, tried to, basically sanction the ICC, tried to shut down the United Nations Committee on Human Rights, trying to shut down the UN, the UNRWA, all of these things that these international bodies, as you said, are seeking to, protect human rights, protect human health rights, and try to keep the global order. These are the organizations that the Israelis and the Americans, under the Trump administration at least, want to see attacked. I'm very optimistic. You know me, Jamal, I'm very pessimistic usually. But I see that the timing of these mass movements, Black Lives Matter and George Floyd, are really going to turbocharge and help facilitate some of these other movements that we're seeing, like the BDS movement and other movements confronting racism and attacks on human and health rights all over the world.
Yeah, and I've been looking at the history of basically what's happening at the ICC, and frankly, if you look at it before, just because there has been a change in the leadership, right. They avoided bringing any charges against the United States. I mean, how could they go after the only superpower in the world on Iraq or anything else, even before going back to some abuses in Vietnam and so forth? and they have avoided this. And of course, the United States has veto power at the United Nations. Nobody wants to kind of mess with the United States. We are, in a way, the United States puts itself as the arbitrator in everything, right? And so there has been a change now under the Trump administration, because they didn't bring these things under Obama, didn't bring these things under Clinton and so forth. Only under the Trump administration, they feel empowered, seeing that this guy doesn't care and he doesn't care about human rights. Maybe we should now start targeting the United States.
Right.
Now, as far as Israel for years avoided this because the claim is, which it's important for our listeners to know, is that, Palestine is not a country. That's how was the plan. Palestine was not a member of these different organizations. And if you remember a few years ago, the Israelis were freaking out, including, by the way, even the United States was against having Palestine joining the different memberships in different bodies, at the UN when it was permitted. So as basically Palestine was recognized by the United Nations and was given a seat as moved from the observer seat to kind of being given the right to basically, it's been 5 years to basically join these different organizations. They now have the right to bring these charges, and Mahmoud Abbas, for years people were encouraging him. Well, why don't you bring Israel to the ICC? And he was like, "Oh well, let's wait. We're still negotiating." And then so finally they said, "Okay, fine, do whatever you want to do." Right? So that's what made the changes, both on the United States because of basically Trump, and both on Israel because now. You can advance Palestinian cases through the ICC.
Well, I know this sounds really crazy what I'm going to say, Jamal, but Donald Trump may be the best thing to happen to human rights and international accountability than anybody. His outrageous behavior, like the Israeli outrageous behavior, is finally getting some traction in terms of accountability. Now, the Israelis felt protected for 70 years, Jamal, because of the United States. That protection is now beginning to fade. So, this could be a very interesting time. But
listen to this, Jess, it will blow your mind. We've mentioned the prosecutor, Bensouda, right? And Bensouda, ever since he brought this... ever she brought these, she has been denied a visa to travel to the United States.
Of course.
And Washington has threatened to confiscate her and the ICC judges' assets and put them on trial. The United States has also vowed to use force to liberate any Americans put in the dock. In other words, if they arrest a human right violator, which that's what you do to war criminals, that the United States will invade the court and free the perpetrators if they were Americans. So basically, the United States wants to talk about human rights, but there is an exceptionalism for the United States and Israel.
Well,
basically the United States and Israel are untouchable.
I think the way this global movement is happening to confront this, Jamal, is giving both Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu a little bit of reconsideration of their thuggish behavior. Okay, Jamal, we only have a few minutes left, and I wanted to make sure we did a quick update. Bad news on the COVID-19 situation. Worldwide, we have 7.5 million cases and 420 global deaths. This is a dramatic increase. And in terms of the United States, Jamal, we've hit a very grim milestone. 2 million people plus Americans have been diagnosed as having the COVID-19 virus. And we're now, as of this morning, 113,500 Americans have died. 24 states, Jamal, since they've reopened, since Memorial Day, and since there's been a relaxing of people's ability to go out. We've seen up to 24 states with dramatic increases in the number of cases. Arizona, for example, had to institute emergency procedures today, Jamal, because, the number of hospitalizations for the COVID-19 is spiking out of control. We see the same thing happening in Texas and in Florida. And as we've been saying on the show for a long time, Jamal, this COVID pandemic is nowhere near to being on top of, and yet people are going forward with reopening and I'm afraid in a very kind of unthoughtful way. We also have to call out California. In Los Angeles, in SoCal, dramatic increases in the number of people who are diagnosed, who are hospitalized, and who are dying. So the situation remains very grim, in my opinion.
So what's going to happen? I mean, I've looked at the calendar. A lot of states are going to be opening fully, basically. Some start right few days from now, mid-June. Others, several states said that July 4th, which is, a big weekend, everything was going to be open. And so what's going to happen then?
Here's what's going to happen. More people are going to get infected, more people are going to get hospitalized, and more people are going to die. And whatever flattening of the curve that we've seen in this country, there's the real potential that flattening could be undone. And what the models are predicting now, and the models have been pretty accurate for the most part, we're going to see a very dramatic second wave of infection, hospitalizations, and death in the fall, Jamal, probably in September after the kind of summer months. And then as we go into the fall and winter with the flu season happening and the coronavirus happening at the same time, it's looking very bleak right now for the future.
Well, your predictions, sadly, match the reaction from the financial markets today because that temporary euphoria that things are improving and there was a recovery in the markets today. I think the markets plunged like something initially over 1,000 points, 1,500 points, because people are, or at least people who are in the financial business, do not believe that we're seeing any progress in controlling the spread of the coronavirus.
So let me ask you, Jamal, when was the last time you heard from the United States Coronavirus Task Force?
Haven't. Those updates, I only basically watched the Governor Newsom and others, but not the president
or vice president. They stopped giving briefings. And here's another thing you're not hearing about, Jamal.
Because they're not going to be giving any positive briefings.
No, and here's the other thing. There is a dramatic shortage of personal protective equipment still. You still have nurses and doctors and health professionals still not having enough personal protective equipment still. So there still remains very big shortages for that. This is going to have dramatic, catastrophic consequences, Jamal. And we don't have time to talk about it today, but in Africa and in South America and now in the Middle East, we're seeing big spikes. We're seeing last week there was a big spike in North Korea, which was touted as being a success. So,
So quickly, Jess, is this the second wave of coronavirus, or is it just a build-up on the first wave? Because
I think this is a build-up, frankly, and I think what this is you saw what happens when you relax the prohibitions. When people are allowed to go out and not practice social distancing, you see a spike. The second wave is going to come in the fall when the virus gets re-energized and people are doing even less social distancing. And like the flu, it's going to come back with unfortunately, I believe it's going to come back with a vengeance. Now, Dr. Fauci said, and this is in spite of the Trump administration not saying anything, and he's going to have his big Republican convention with all of these people, probably in Jacksonville, Dr. Fauci saying this is his worst nightmare, what he's seeing right now with all of these spikes. So,
well, on this bad note, Jess, I don't want to hear more.
We better stop on that bad note, right?
On that bad note.
You've been listening
I was
to,
hoping.
Yeah, I'm sorry I don't have any good news. So sorry, listeners, but you've been listening to Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM. You are listening to us on many different ways, 89.5 FM, on our podcast, ArabTalkRadio.com, Jamal's Facebook page, which is Jamal Dajani 2. And gosh, we hope to be back with you next week, continuing to give you the real news, not the news that's in denial here on Arab Talk.
Talk to you next week.